Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're working on the rear axles on the Tamiya wrecker, going through bag C. We've got lots of bits to play with this time, although the two axles are more or less the same, so there's going to be a fair few repeats. Right then, straight to it. Step 16, the rear leaf spring packs. We need 4 3x14 step screws, 2 round bushings, the silver ones that look like really tall top hats, 2 spring seats, 4 U-bolts, 4 stays, 5 M3 nylock nuts, 8 thin M3 nylock nuts, and the really long screw. For plastic we need 2 F2s and 2 F8s. First then we need to make the 2 spring and mount assemblies. We use 2 of the U-bolts over F2, slotting them into the guides. Then pop the F2 over the centre rivet on the outside of the leaf pack. On the inside we use one of the F8s followed by a spring seat. To clamp it all up we use the 4 thin nylocks on the ends of the U-bolts. Just like when we did the front suspension, we don't want to tighten them up all the way just yet. Do them up evenly, but so there's still a little bit of movement in the parts. On the ends of the springs we fit the stays with a step screw and a full height nylock, one on each end. When done it should look a little bit like this. Make a second one and we can fit them to the chassis. All we do is pop one of the bushings into the hole in F2 so the flange is on the outside, then pass the long screw through the bushing, through the rear of the chassis, through the cross member and out the other side. The other leaf spring assembly goes on the other side with its bushing, then we use the last nut to hold it all together. When doing this one up, do keep in mind that it's a really long screw in there, so it might be a bit tricky to feel when it's fully done up. The screw will twist and even to an extent stretch. As long as it's tight enough to take out any free play, plus an extra 1/8 of a turn or so, it's going to be just fine. What you really don't want to do is just keep going and shear off the screw head. When done, the 2 spring assemblies should freely swing on their bushings with no catching or binding. Step 17, the differentials. For this one we need 2 of the 2 diff case parts, 4 of the large internal gears, 6 of the small internal gears, 2 star shafts, 4 thin steel washers, and 6 M2x5 caphead screws. Usually you'd build these up with a supplied ceramic grease, which is a very good lightweight lubricant. However, because it makes for some freely running diffs, you can find yourself in a situation where you're giving the truck some throttle, but it's not going anywhere. Usually one of the wheels is unloaded and just spinning freely. To help with this, I've been using some really thick and sticky blue lithium in my last few builds. It still lets the diff do its thing, but it adds a little bit of stickiness, so you're a bit less likely to get stuck. Plus, if it mixes with Tamiya ceramic grease, it's not going to react, so we don't need to worry about leaks. The diffs are going to be well and truly buried in the axle when we're done. If they ever need servicing, there's going to be quite a lot to take apart, so we need to get them right first time. We start off with one of the large bevel gears and add some grease to its back side. Pop one of the large washers on and apply some more grease to the washer. The gear then drops into the gear half of the housing. Next to the small gears, we grab a star shaft and apply a blob of grease onto one of the stubs. Then spin on one of the small bevel gears so it spreads out the grease as it goes. Repeat with the other 2 and it's ready to fit. If you use blue lithium grease, try not to get it on your fingers as it does tend to stain things just a little. All the parts that make up the diff are metal, and we really don't want anything falling apart once it's in the axle housing. So we're going to add a little bit of thread lock to the threaded holes before we put it all together. Just a spot on a cocktail stick and spread it around in the holes. Right, now for the fun bit. We want to pretty much pack the diff with grease. The idea being the gears won't be able to fling it away once running. I'm using an ice lolly stick to blob it in around the large bevel gear first. Then we drop the star shaft, lining up the stubs with the cutouts in the outside of the diff case, gently pressing them home so the gears are nicely meshed. Now we'll add some more grease, filling all the gaps between the gears. And now on the top we need to add the second large bevel gear, grease up the top, add a large washer, grease that up too, and if there's any more space for grease we're going to add some more. Then we pop on the other half of the diff case and install the 3 screws. Install all 3 so they take up the slack, then nip them up a little bit at a time until they're bottomed out. You really need to bring the halves together straight so everything stays lined up. Remember, once a truck's built, you're really not going to want to have to take it apart again. Chances are, now it's all been squeezed together, there's going to be a little bit of grease leakage, so wipe up before moving on. It's the kind of stuff that ends up getting absolutely everywhere, so you need to stay on top of the cleanup. Both the diffs are exactly the same, so we'll build up the other one off camera, and that's step 17 complete. Step 18, axle shafts and the axle cases with the bevel gears. For plastic parts we need 3 axle cases with the hole in the middle for a bevel gear. That's 2 A1s and an A3. Then for the metal bits we have the diffs, axle shafts, 3 bevel gears with a shaft, 4 1150 bearings from the kit, plus 10 more from the aftermarket bearing kit, so we replace the bushings. Lastly, there's 11 4mm E-clips. First, just to get them out of the way, we're going to fit the bevel gears to the cases. If you're using the stock bushings, you'll need to break out the ceramic grease, but with the bearings you're better off leaving them dry. The grease is just going to attract dust and dirt and generally make an unnecessary mess. To fit the gears, we pop one of the bearings over the gear shaft and press it into the inside of the case. You should be able to press it in all the way until the bearing bottoms out in the hole. Then from the outside we fit another bearing over the shaft so it sits flush with the plastic. It's important to fit the bearing with the shaft in place so they go in nice and straight. If they go in at a bit of an angle, you can get them stuck, making it a bit of a faff to sort out. To stop the shaft from falling out, we need to use an E-clip in the slot near the end. Quite simple, we just need to do it twice more so the axle cases are all ready for the next steps. The axle shafts are even easier to assemble, if a bit fiddly. All we do is clip an E-clip into one of the slots, doesn't matter which, slide on 2 bearings and clip another E-clip in at the other end. Repeat with the 3 shafts and they're ready to fit. On each diff we want 1 shaft with a hole and 1 with a pin to go into the diffs so the splines locate in the large internal bevel gears. Sometimes they can be a bit reluctant to go in, so you need to use some gentle pressure and rotate and slightly wiggle them until they find their way in. Complete 2 and they're ready to fit. Right now, if we try and turn the axle shafts in opposite directions, the diff is more or less completely solid. With lots of leverage, we could turn the internal gears, but it's going to free up on its own once we're running the truck. The grease is extremely thick, and it's going to take it a minute or so for everything to settle. Okay, step 18, the front rear axle. We're going to need 8 M3x15s, 8 M3 plain nuts, 2 drive cups and 2 M3x4 grub screws. First job, so we don't lose the grub screw, is to fit the drive cups. Pop a grub onto the end of an Allen key and apply a bit of thread lock. Screw it into the drive cup a couple of turns and offer it up to the bevel gear shaft on the A3 axle case, the one with the hex-shaped holes, and tighten up the grub screw so it's biting on the flat of the shaft. Do the same with one of the A1 cases, one of the ones with the round holes. Okay, now it doesn't matter which half we start with, so grab one of the axle cases and apply some ceramic grease to the bevel gear. Drop in the diff and shaft assembly so the bearings are in their slots, 2 right on the outside and 2 just either side of the diff. It's worth noting, due to the shape of the axle cases, you really can't get the diff in backwards, so if it fits, you're good to go. To make sure the grease gets everywhere, we're going to add some more around the diff gear and rotate it to spread around the grease. Add a little more grease to the other bevel gear and we can bring the 2 halves together. It's worth noting, if you add too much grease, the worst that's going to happen is it's going to get flung off and make a bit of a mess inside the axle. Too little and you do run the risk of the gears wearing out prematurely. So to a large extent, more is almost always better. Next we fit all the screws and nuts. Initially we just take up the slack on all of them, then we add a little bit of thread lock around the nuts before loosening the screws a couple of turns and re-tightening them up so they're done up properly. Again, we really don't want to have to take these apart again or try and replace a screw if it drops out, so we need to get it right first time. When done, the axle should spin fairly freely. It might be a little bit notchy at this stage, but it'll smooth out within a couple of minutes of running when the truck's finished. As long as you build it carefully, it'll usually sort itself out pretty quickly. Step 20, the rear axle, which is pretty much the same as the front rear axle, except there's only one bevel gear and the other half of the case is an A2. This time we need the same 8 M3x15s and 8 M3 plain nuts, a single drive cup and a single M3x4 grub screw. Assembly is exactly the same as the last step, so we're just going to skip to it being finished. Internally it's all greased up and all the screws have been thread locked. Step 21, attaching the axle to the chassis. For screws and all the other bits we need 8 M3x20s, 4 3x18 step screws, 4 3x14 step screws, 4 M3 nylocks, 4 M3 flange nuts, the short dog bone shaft, and 4 suspension stays. For plastic we need 2 F6s and 2, I've got F6s again here, but it will be something different, to make up the lower suspension arms. Before we fit anything to the chassis, we need to be 100% sure that we've got the axles the right way up. The diagrams in the manual are pretty good, so make sure you're all matched up. If you get them the wrong way up, the wheels will spin the wrong way, which can be problematic when you try driving the truck. When you're sure you've got them the right way up, the actual fitting is quite straightforward. We grab one of the stays and drop in a pair of the M3x20s. Then we offer them up to the underside of the axle and pass the screws through and line them up with the brackets on the end of the leaf spring. Take up the slack in the screws, but don't fully tighten them just yet. Flip the axle over and apply some thread lock on the exposed threads, then loosen and retighten all 4. This time nip them up so they're bottomed out plus a little bit extra. The rear axle fits in exactly the same way, just double check it's the right way up. Back in step 16, when we built the leaf packs, we left the nuts on the U-bolts just a little bit loose. Now we have the ends tied together by the axles, we can tighten them up the rest of the way. Plus, once the arm goes on, the nuts are going to be a little bit tricky to get to. The arms next, which get attached to the chassis with the long step screws and a flange nut. The arms go on so that the end with the built-in spacer sits up against the chassis. We just offer it up with the step screw and apply a little bit of thread lock before threading on the nut and tightening it up. You should end up with an arm that swings perfectly freely, and to be honest, the tolerances are so big something would have to be very wrong for these to have any sort of bind. But you never know, stranger things have happened. Install all 4 and we can start attaching them to the axle. But first, don't forget to pop in the drive shaft. Once the arms are fitted, we won't be able to rotate the axles to get it in. Now we use the shorter step screws from the outside with one of the nylock nuts to hold it in. Do all 4 and that's the axles hung. The axles should freely move up and down, and if you spin the input drive cup, they should both spin the right way. If so, that's step 21 complete. Step 22, the rear dampers. Now these are exactly the same as the bits we put together for the front dampers, so we're going to skip ahead to them being put together. As long as you build them with a bit of grease and you don't over tighten the plastic rod ends, you're going to be good to go. Step 23, fitting the dampers. Right, we're going to need 4 M3x15s, 4 M3 nylocks, 4 3x14 step screws and 4 damper collars. For plastic we have 4 F5s, the spacer cover widgets that cover the top of the dampers. All 4 fit in the same way, so we'll concentrate on one and then we'll cut to the rest being done. Right, we need to pop one of the collars into the top of the damper. From the other side we insert one of the screws. Pass the thread through one of the plastic bits, then offer it up to the chassis where we have a threaded hole for the screw. Take up the slack, but don't fully tighten just yet. At the bottom we line up the rod end with the suspension stay and insert a shoulder screw. Then to keep it from falling out we add one of the nylocks and tighten it up. As the finishing touch, we need to thread lock the top screw, which we do by using a cocktail stick to add some to the exposed thread in the chassis, then loosening and fully retightening the screw. It's the same again 3 more times, so do that and that's the rear axles hung and ready to go. I think that makes the chassis actually start to look like something now, which is a bit of a minor milestone. It's a truck chassis now, rather than just a few bits bolted together. Very cool. Next time we'll be on bag D, or dare I say the D bag, which is the 3-speed gearbox. Something we've covered a few times on the channel already, but it's important to get it right, so we'll go through it in some detail and talk about some of the contentious steps in the build. As always then, thanks for watching, like if you like, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment if there's something on your mind. Bye guys!